The hall was silent, but the words cut like thunder. You cannot claim to be the United Nations while ignoring the voice of 54 nations. For 2 decades, Africa has spoken with one voice demanding justice, fairness, and a seat at the highest table of global power. Yet, those demands have been met with delay, dismissal, or polite avoidance. At the United Nations' 80th anniversary, a question now echoes louder than any applause: has this institution, once created to prevent another world war, already drifted into irrelevance? 80 years ago, the UN rose from the ashes of global destruction. It was meant to unite humanity, to ensure that every nation, no matter how small, had a voice. But today, the structure still reflects the world of 1945, not 2025. 5 nations hold permanent power, while Africa, with its 1.4 billion people and 54 countries, has none. The very continent that contributes some of the largest peacekeeping forces and that bears the heaviest cost of conflict is still excluded from the council that decides its fate. This isn't just unfair, it's dangerous, because when entire continents are sidelined, the legitimacy of the whole system collapses. That is why African leaders are no longer asking politely. They are warning reform the United Nations or watch it follow the League of Nations into the graveyard of history. So tonight we ask, can the UN truly survive without reform? Can an institution that ignores half the world's population still call itself united? Or is Africa ready to walk away and build something new? Please stay with us until the end. Share this video if you believe Africa's call for justice is long overdue. And subscribe if you believe the truth matters more than the headlines. The stage was set in New York at the 80th anniversary of the United Nations General Assembly. Flags from every corner of the globe lined the chamber, yet beneath the grandeur there was tension in the air. Delegates whispered, cameras zoomed in. When the president of Kenya stepped forward to speak, he was not just speaking for his own nation. He was carrying the weight of an entire continent, a continent that for 20 years had been asking the same question: when will Africa finally have a seat at the world's highest table? His words drew directly from history. He reminded the Assembly of the League of Nations created in 1919 after the First World War. Its vision was noble collective security, disarmament, peaceful dispute resolution. But the League collapsed not because its mission was flawed, but because it could not adapt, could not act, and lost its legitimacy. When Japan invaded Manchuria, when Italy marched into Ethiopia, when Hitler broke every rule, the League stood powerless. By the late 1930s, it had already become irrelevant, and with the outbreak of World War II, it ceased to matter at all. The president's comparison was deliberate. He warned that the United Nations now risks walking the same doomed path. 8 decades ago, the UN was built to correct those failures, to be stronger, more inclusive, and to protect succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Yet, in 2025, the Security Council remains frozen in the arrangements of 1945, dominated by 5 permanent powers. The world has changed dramatically, but the UN has not. He painted a stark picture of today's crises: wars raging in Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, Somalia, the Sahel. Climate disasters intensifying year after year, inequality growing wider, pandemics threatening, technology advancing faster than governance can respond. At precisely the moment when humanity needs a strong United Nations, the institution faces a crisis of credibility and capacity. Its bureaucracy slows action. Its budget is shrinking. Its blue helmets, once symbols of authority and protection, no longer command the same respect. Africa, he said, knows this reality better than anyone. African nations dominate the agenda of the Security Council. African troops form some of the largest contingents of UN peacekeepers, and African civilians pay the highest price in blood, displacement, and suffering when the system fails. Yet Africa remains the only continent without a permanent seat at the table where decisions about peace, war, and development are made. The injustice does not end there. He turned to the global financial system, exposing the imbalance with shocking numbers. During the IMF's recent allocation of special drawing rights, 64% went to wealthy nations that had little need for liquidity support. The poorest countries, those most desperate for relief, received only 2.4%. What a disconnect, he said. This too is why Africa must build its own financial sovereignty. To that end, he outlined 3 institutions championed by the African Union: the Africa Central Bank to issue a single currency and free African trade from dependence on foreign money; the Africa Monetary Fund to stabilize African economies and protect them from manipulation; the Africa Investment Bank to mobilize resources for infrastructure, industry, and integration. And to complete this vision, Africa has already established its own credit rating agency, one that values Africa fairly, not through the distorted lens of Wall Street or Paris. The chamber grew tense as he spoke. This was not the language of a junior partner asking politely. This was the voice of a continent declaring its intention. He congratulated the new president of the General Assembly, offered Kenya's support, and honored the UN's achievements in fighting smallpox, HIV/AIDS, Ebola, and COVID-19. He acknowledged the UN's role in humanitarian relief and peacekeeping. But his message was clear: without reform, all those achievements risk being overshadowed by irrelevance. The event marked more than a speech. It was the unveiling of Africa's line in the sand. The history of the League of Nations was no longer a distant memory. It was a warning shot aimed directly at the United Nations. The silence in the chamber deepened as the president of Kenya moved from history into demand. His voice sharpened, no longer reflective, but resolute. He declared what Africa has long whispered in frustration and shouted in protests outside these very halls: Africa is no longer willing to wait on the margins of global governance. Our exclusion is not only unfair, it is grossly unjust, and it undermines the credibility of this organization. Then came the moment of climax. He laid out Africa's bottom line in language as precise as it was uncompromising. Africa, he said, must be granted at least 2 permanent seats on the United Nations Security Council with full rights, including the right to veto, along with 2 additional non-permanent seats. No longer would Africa accept symbolic participation. No longer would it tolerate decisions being made about its wars, its refugees, its resources, without its own voice at the table. You cannot claim to be the United Nations, he thundered while ignoring the voice of 54 nations. The words were more than rhetoric. They were a warning. Reform is not charity. Reform is not a favor to Africa. Reform is the only way for the United Nations to survive into the 21st century. Without it, he said, this body will follow the League of Nations into irrelevance and collapse. The chamber reacted in waves. Some African delegations rose in applause, pounding their desks in solidarity. Others, particularly from Europe and North America, sat frozen in uncomfortable silence. For them, the words were unsettling because they struck at the heart of a system built to preserve their dominance in 1945. A few diplomats exchanged hurried notes, faces tight with unease. Cameras caught the tension, a clash not of weapons, but of legitimacy. The president pressed on, refusing to let the silence dilute his message. He reminded the assembly that Africa bears the brunt of the UN's failures: the wars in Sudan, Somalia, the Sahel, the humanitarian disasters in Congo and beyond. African soldiers risk their lives under the blue helmet. African civilians bury their dead when the system fails. And yet decisions are made in closed rooms, where Africa has no permanent seat, no veto, no guarantee that its voice is heard. The speech struck a nerve because it was not only about Africa, it was about the future of global governance itself. If the United Nations continues to reflect the balance of power from 1945, can it truly claim to represent the world of 2025? The answer, he suggested, was obvious: no. In that moment, the General Assembly felt less like a commemoration of the UN's 80 years and more like a trial of its very survival. The president had turned the occasion into a reckoning. He reminded the world that the League of Nations, too, once held ceremonies and gave speeches. But when it ignored reality, when it failed to act inclusively, it was buried by history. The United Nations now stands at the same crossroads: reform or decay. The reaction across the African bloc was electric. Delegates from West Africa, the Sahel, and Southern Africa exchanged nods, their applause rising in defiance. They knew this was their collective voice, not just Kenya's. This was the Esselwini Consensus of 2005 brought back to life, but with sharper urgency. For 20 years, Africa had politely requested. Now it was demanding. Observers from outside Africa were more cautious. Some whispered that granting Africa permanent seats could dilute the Security Council's efficiency. Others worried about shifting the balance of veto power. But those arguments rang hollow in the face of raw moral clarity. How could an entire continent remain voiceless while its crises dominate the agenda? The climax of the speech was not just the demand itself, but the moral force behind it. It was Africa saying to the world, "Listen to us, or lose us." For the first time in years, the General Assembly chamber felt like a battleground not of weapons, but of legitimacy, justice, and survival. The president's warning was not abstract. It carried with it very real consequences for the United Nations for Africa and for the ordinary people whose lives depend on whether global governance works or fails. If the UN continues to ignore Africa's demands, the first casualty will be credibility. An institution that claims to represent all humanity, but excludes 54 nations from permanent decision-making, loses its moral authority. Once legitimacy collapses, every resolution, every peacekeeping mission, every declaration of global solidarity begins to look hollow. This is how the League of Nations died, not with a single event, but with a slow erosion of trust. The UN risks the same fate. The political consequences for Africa are equally profound. If reform stalls, African nations may increasingly turn away from the United Nations and toward alternative alliances. Already we see the rise of new blocs, the Alliance of Sahel States, AES BRICS Plus, and the African Union's own financial institutions. These are not just symbolic gestures. They are the building blocks of a parallel order, one in which Africa writes its own rules rather than waiting endlessly for reform that never comes. The speech also exposed the civilian cost of inaction. From Haiti to Gaza, from Sudan to the Sahel, ordinary people pay the highest price when the UN fails to act decisively. In Haiti, the Kenyan-led security mission achieved remarkable progress despite being underfunded and understaffed. Schools reopened, streets cleared of gangs, and government buildings reclaimed. And yet the mission was left without adequate support, operating at less than 40% of its authorized strength. What more could have been achieved if the UN had matched its rhetoric with resources? For civilians trapped in conflict zones, the UN's paralysis means children go without education, families are displaced, and entire communities live under the shadow of violence. In Gaza, the disproportionate use of military force has left thousands dead, yet the Security Council remains paralyzed by vetoes. In Sudan, rival armies tear the country apart while civilians starve, and still the Council issues little more than statements. Without reform, these tragedies will multiply. Domestically, the speech signaled a turning point for Africa's own citizens. For decades, many Africans have viewed the UN as a distant institution, more symbolic than practical. But by demanding reform, African leaders are telling their people, we will no longer accept second-class status in the global order. This is not just about international prestige. It is about ensuring that when peace negotiations, development funds, or climate finance are decided, Africa's voice is not missing. There is also a psychological dimension. For generations, Africans have lived under the weight of external decisions, borders drawn in Europe, financial conditions imposed by Washington, conflicts debated in New York. The refusal to reform the UN reinforces this old hierarchy, but the demand for permanent seats is a declaration of psychological independence. It tells the world, and Africa's youth especially, that the continent is ready to shape its own destiny. Ultimately, the consequences fall into two stark choices. Reform could breathe new life into the UN, restoring its legitimacy and ensuring that its peacekeeping, humanitarian, and climate initiatives remain effective. But refusal to reform will accelerate Africa's pivot away, pushing the continent to build its own governance structures. And when 1.4 billion people step out of the system, it will not be the Africans who are left behind, it will be the United Nations itself. From Washington's perspective, the demand for African seats on the UN Security Council is more than a procedural debate. It is a direct challenge to a system the United States helped design in 1945, a system built to enshrine the power of a few victors of World War II. America has long defended this structure, arguing that stability requires limited veto powers. But in the eyes of much of the world, that defense now sounds less like principle and more like privilege. For many Americans, especially those over 60 who remember the Cold War era, the United Nations still symbolizes the hope of avoiding global catastrophe. They remember peacekeepers in blue helmets, grain shipments to starving children, and bold declarations of human rights. Yet those same Americans have also watched as the Security Council froze during genocides in Rwanda, wars in Iraq, and crises in Gaza. The contradiction is clear. The UN is capable of great good, but paralyzed by old rules. The speech in New York struck at this contradiction. For U.S. policymakers, Africa's demand for reform is unsettling because it shifts the conversation from aid to authority. For decades, Washington has cast itself as the benefactor, sending aid packages, deploying peacekeepers, or offering loans through the IMF and World Bank. But Africa is no longer asking for charity. It is asking for equal power, including veto rights that could one day counter American positions. That is a radical shift, and it explains the discomfort visible in the chamber. Globally, reactions are mixed. Europe. Some governments quietly acknowledge that reform is overdue, but fear losing influence if Africa gains permanent seats. China and Russia both present themselves as champions of a multipolar world, using Africa's demand to highlight Western hypocrisy, even as they seek influence of their own. Latin America and Asia countries like Brazil, India, and Indonesia echo Africa's frustration, seeing the UN as a club of the old powers that no longer reflects demographic or economic realities. For Africa, this global moment is strategic. By linking its voice to broader movements for reform, from Latin America's push for Brazil's seat to Asia's call for India's inclusion, the continent turns its demand into part of a worldwide coalition. If ignored, that coalition could one day bypass the UN altogether, building alternative forms of legitimacy. From an American perspective, the choice is stark. Support reform, and the United States could rebuild trust with Africa and the global South, demonstrating that democracy means more than slogans. Resist reform, and America risks pushing Africa further into the arms of China, Russia, and BRICS+. For U.S. citizens watching at home, the question becomes deeply personal. Is the United Nations a tool for global justice or merely an instrument of old empires? And for the world, the broader question echoes: can humanity still rely on the UN as the anchor of international cooperation, or is the time approaching when a new order must take its place? 80 years after its birth, the United Nations finds itself standing at a crossroads. It can either reform, embracing the voices that have long been silenced, or it can sink slowly into irrelevance, remembered only as another League of Nations that failed to adapt. The warning delivered in New York was not just a speech, it was a line in the sand. Africa, with its 54 nations and 1.4 billion people, will no longer accept being treated as a spectator in decisions that determine its future. The message is simple, but urgent reform is not optional. Without African representation at the Security Council, every declaration of united becomes an empty echo. Without fairness in global finance, every promise of development sounds hollow. Without genuine equality, the very foundation of multilateralism crumbles. And once that foundation is gone, the world risks descending into a new age of fragmentation, where power blocks replace cooperation, and ordinary people from Gaza to Sudan to Haiti pay the price. Yet there is still hope. Reforming the United Nations could revitalize global governance. By granting Africa permanent seats, by restructuring global finance, by ensuring that humanitarian law applies to all conflicts equally, the UN could reclaim its role as humanity's best chance at solidarity. It could prove that this institution is not a relic of 1945, but a living framework capable of guiding the world through the storms of the 21st century. But if change is denied, Africa will not stand idle. From the Africa Central Bank to the Alliance of Sahel States, from BRICS+ to the new Africa Credit Rating Agency, the continent is already building its own architecture of sovereignty. The future will not wait. Either the UN evolves with Africa, or it risks being replaced by the very voices it tried to exclude. So tonight, we leave you with questions that matter far beyond diplomacy. Do you believe the United Nations can truly reform before it's too late? Should America support Africa's demand for permanent seats, or cling to the privileges of 1945? And if the UN collapses, what kind of world will replace it? Please share this video if you believe Africa's call for justice is long overdue, and subscribe if you believe that the truth is more important than the headlines. Because in the end, the survival of the United Nations is not just about institutions. It is about whether we as a global community are willing to finally treat every nation, large or small, rich or poor, African or American, as equals.